Craving your next action-packed adventure? Audible delivers thrills of every kind on your command, like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, where a lone astronaut must save humanity from extinction, narrated with stunning intensity by Ray Porter. From electrifying suspense and daring quest to spine-tingling horror and romance in far-off realms, unleash your adventurous side with gripping titles that'll keep you guessing. Discover exclusive Audible originals, hotly anticipated new releases, and must-listen bestsellers that hook you from the first minute. Because Audible knows there's no greater thrill than the one that speaks to you. Discover what lies beyond the edge of your seat. Start your free 30-day trial at audible.com/WonderyUS. That's audible.com/WonderyUS.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 39 of the True Crime All the Time Unsolved podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson, and with me, as always, is my partner in true crime, Mike Gibson. Gibby, what's going on today?
Hey, man, what's happening?
What's happening? We had a lot of talk last week about what's happening.
Oh, yeah. A little
trip down memory lane.
Yeah.
What a great show, man.
Good times.
That was a good show, too.
Good. Yeah. Moving on up.
No, that's the Jeffersons.
Oh, I got them all over the place.
Good Times was Jimmy Walker. Dynamite!
Dynamite.
Don't you remember that? Good Times?
Yeah, I do remember that. I get all the shows mixed up.
Well, there was a lot of shows back then.
Yeah. Facts of Life. Is that one?
Yes, that was a show.
Okay.
You just
Joe and Natalie. Or
yeah,
like that.
Yeah, you got it. Tootie.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, now I remember. It's all coming back. It's like the floodgates have opened.
And that's scary.
Yeah, it is.
To have
scary.
your floodgates open.
It
is a very scary thought.
Just don't know what you get.
So let's do our Patreon shout outs. We had Bridget Bernard, Ulysses Moore, Lois Carey, John Woolley. We had M, just goes by M, E-M.
Yeah, when you first say it, I think like from Bond, James Bond movies, you know, M.
Bond.
Yeah.
James Bond.
Yeah, Bond. James Bond.
No, but M's great. She just wants to go by M.
Well, thanks, EM.
EM. And I always get a kick out of it because that's my nickname for my daughter, Emmy. And we had Tyler Whitfield came out at our highest level.
Thank you.
And then we had Jacob A. Stone.
Esquire,
maybe. And he comes out above our highest level, I guess, to just put himself in big baller status.
Drop the mic.
Yeah, mic drop and just walks off.
Can you just do something like this?
What are you doing? You're just hitting the microphone?
Yeah, like he dropped it.
Got the stabilizer on there, man. You can't even hear it hardly. But no, we appreciate it. We have Liz Hunter, Allison Foreman Rickert, and then we have Christy Lee Gibbs, and we have to talk about this from last week's episode.
Yeah,
I goofed.
Yes, you did.
And I assumed that Christy Lee was the Christy Lee from Canadian True Crime. She listened to the episode, reached out to me and said, hey, I love y'all, but it wasn't me. So I have to give an apology to the non-podcasting Christy Lee,
right,
who's supporting us on Patreon. But the podcasting Christy Lee, and this just shows you what an amazing person she is, she started supporting us just because she got a kick out of what
I love it.
How everything went down last week.
Who else can we guilt and shame into?
There was no guilting. There was no shaming.
I'd like to give a shout out to the captain for supporting us.
That's funny. So let's go back into the vault. And this week we picked Savvy Geek Girl.
Savvy.
Been supporting us at a high level, Gibbs, for a long time. And very much appreciated. And like we talk about, we appreciate everyone. We appreciate the new supporters. We appreciate the people that have been with us a long time. And then outside of Patreon, we love the Facebook activity. We love our Twitter supporters. We love our Instagram followers and those people. So much interaction that it's hard to even put it into words.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I keep hearing from everyone that, not only am I listening, but I got so-and-so at work into it, and then they talk to somebody. I mean, that's how you make a show grow. It really is. So when you're done listening to this episode, make sure you jump over. If you haven't already, check out the True Crime All the Time episode that's just dropped. We're going to Scotland.
Aye, Captain.
That's close. And we're talking about, if you want to hear Gibby do a Scottish brogue, listen to this episode. I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum.
I don't even know what that means, but okay.
Okay. We're doing Robert Black. This guy, lower than low, Gibbs, piece of human garbage.
It just hit me. Now I know why you have your kilt thing on. I was like, it's strange.
Yeah.
Coming into the studio and you're wearing a skirt, but I get it now.
No,
it's a kilt.
Right.
Yeah, it looks like maybe some Catholic schoolgirl's skirt, but I get what you're doing. You're trying to make it look like a kilt. Cool. All right, sorry.
I like to get into the theme of the show. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a little tight, by the way. Just get that out there.
So check out the episode on Robert Black over in Scotland. All right, Gibbs, you ready to get into this episode, True Crime All the Time Unsolved?
Yeah, and it's kind of spooky for me because we're in October. We're that week of Friday the 13th. That a lot of movies with campsites and campgrounds and just spooky stuff,
Now, I get what you're saying because we're talking about the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, and the details of this are so scary that it is like something you would see in a movie, one of those camp counselor type horror movies.
Yeah, absolutely is what it is.
But it's not. It's real. It really happened. And to me, that makes it that much scarier, right? I can watch a scary movie and I know it's not real. I know Jason in his hockey mask is not coming through my front door.
Well, not in one piece.
And if he did, he wouldn't last very long. Yeah. But that doesn't scare me. What scares me is these real life stories that we talk about because real people lost their lives. There's real tragedy here. A movie is entertainment. This is a story about real tragedy, plain and simple. So the Girl Scout murders occurred back in 1977 at a place called Camp Scott. And this was located in Locust Grove, Oklahoma. And the camp was a retreat for Girl Scouts and brownies and had been since 1928.
Pretty well established.
Yeah, it had been around a long time. And it was a big place. It was said to have been over 400 acres of private wooded area.
1977, Camp Scott was made up of 410 acres. It was divided into 10 units, each named after an Indian tribe. 27 little girls were a unit. It was near dense woods at the westernmost boundary of the camp. It had rained the evening before the murders, just after the little girls had arrived at camp and had continued into the night.
So a little intro there, a little foreshadowing of what's to come. And there was something cut out, Gibbs, a little bit as the newscaster was talking.
Yeah.
And where he was saying there was 27 girls assigned to a section of the camp. And the part that cut out was Kiowa.
Kiowa.
That's the section that they were assigned to.
Yes.
Each of the sections was named after a Native American tribe at this camp.
Correct.
So in April of 1977, the camp was having a training course for their counselors and other personnel. During this event, an unknown person came into the tent area and ransacked one of the counselors' tents. There was a note put inside of a donut box that was sitting inside the tent. It was a handwritten note that stated that 3 campers would soon be murdered. Now, that's scary as shit.
That is scary.
We're talking about counselors. Most of them are probably young, I would think. You've got a mix. You've got some that are older adults in charge, and then you have usually a lot of younger counselors that are there to watch over the little kids.
Exactly.
But the counselors dismissed this note. They dismissed the ransacking of the tent as some type of prank or joke.
Which happens a lot when you're at camp, right? You get a lot of that kind of stuff, especially if you're one of the counselors and you're prior to the kids getting there, you play jokes. And even when the kids get there, you kind of get them involved in playing some jokes on the other campers.
Yeah, I get playing jokes and I agree with you, but a note that says that 3 campers are going to be murdered, that is an over the line joke.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I guess they just didn't take it very seriously, and you can't blame them for that. But in hindsight, knowing what we know is going to happen, boy, you wish somebody would have taken it more seriously. I guess that's really all I can say about that. And it's 2 months later that campers load a bus in Tulsa. We're talking about June 12th, 1977, and they're headed for Camp Scott. Camp Scott, about 40 miles away from Tulsa by bus. And you got to think about these campers, Gibbs. These are young kids.
Yeah, they're 8, 9, 10-year-old girls.
So they're really excited. They're all amped up. They're about ready to spend the next 2 weeks at camp. They're going to be, swimming, hiking the trails, sitting out at night at campfires, singing songs, doing arts and crafts, doing all this fun, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that they're probably going to be meeting a lot of new people, a lot of new friends.
There's some anxiety.
Well, some anxiety, but also a lot of
excitement.
Yeah, excitement about, hey, this is going to be a fun 2 weeks. And when the campers got to Camp Scott, they were allowed to choose who they wanted to bunk up with. And we have to talk about the camper tents. They were described as being around 200 square feet. That's not a lot.
No, that's not huge.
That's not a lot of room because inside there's 4 mattresses, 4 bunk bed type.
Yeah, smaller mattresses, yeah.
So they were designed to hold 4 people. But some of the tents would only have 3 campers and the extra bed in the tent would be used as storage. Now, the other thing we have to talk about is, this was a real camping site. This was not a luxurious type situation.
No, this was not glamping.
No, definitely not glamping. There was no electricity to the point that if you needed to use the bathroom at night, you had to grab a flashlight, or they did have some kerosene lanterns. But again, with kids 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, I can't imagine that they were too loosey-goosey with the kerosene lanterns.
No, I don't think so.
So probably what you had is a lot of flashlight usage. And that night, as the campers are all settling in, as it's starting to get dark, a couple of counselors would see 2 men walking around the camp wearing Army-style boots. Now, this is something that they would later report. Stories would come out that one of the men was walking behind the tents and the other man was over by the latrine area. So now we get to the next night, June 13th. The campers have had a full day at the camp. Everybody's settling down. It's dark. It's time to get ready to go to bed.
Yeah. And the night before, it was thunderstorms, a lot of thunder, lightning kind of stuff going on. This night, it's more calm. You don't have the background noise of rain and thunder and all that kind of stuff.
And that's important because some of the counselors would later say that they were awakened by some strange sounds and noises. And they described these as being pretty far off and almost like frog type noises or very light squealing type noises. Not very loud. But this also, Gibbs, goes to the layout of this camp because some of these tents where the campers are, they're kind of remote.
Yeah, they're not bunched together. You're kind of like in your own little zone. And like you said, and there's a couple of them, specifically one that's really far away from the rest of the group.
Yeah, almost on the outskirts, up against the woods, basically.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk more about that as we go. So one of the counselors gets up, has a flashlight, and as they would shine the flashlight into the woods, the noises would stop. She checked on some of the tents, didn't find anything out of the ordinary, and then went back to bed. The other thing that would come out is that through the course of this night, campers would say that, there was a lot of crying. You had a lot of young girls at this camp They were missing their family, missing their moms. They wanted to go home.
And you expect that at a youth camp. You really do. You're going to I've taken my kids to enough camps that when you're registering and get them set up in their cabin or their tents, you hear the other kids screaming, "Don't leave me, Mom." They want to go home. And then you hear the stories when your kids come back about how some of the kids did go home, first night, second night, because they were too scared. And that happens.
Yeah, you have to imagine that for some of these girls, it may have been their very first night away from home.
Sure.
And we're talking about the start of a 2-week period that you're not going to see your family, your mom. That's tough for some kids.
And in most cases, they've never met the people they're camping with, right? So it's all unknown.
So I do want to play a clip from one of the girls that was at the camp. Now, this clip obviously comes later down the road.
13 years ago, Melody Thompson of Cushing was at Camp Scott. She met the 3 little girls who were to become victims on the bus ride between Tulsa and Locust Grove. She remembers that they invited her to share their tent with them, but she declined when she saw how far back in the woods it sat. But the tent she chose had its own problems.
The tent that I went ahead and slept in, the back of it had been slit. The flap was gone. And I took my mother's sheet and put it up there so we wouldn't have to sleep like we were sleeping out on the ground or something between 11:30 and 12. Well, we heard people crying and screaming. Well, we hollered for help, telling them that there was something going wrong, and they just told us to shut up. There wasn't nothing wrong. So we were scared all night.
So she doesn't paint a really good picture, Gibbs, of what's going on. Everybody's scared. They're reaching out to the counselors, and if what she's saying is true, which she has no reason to lie, I don't think, they're basically saying, hey, shut up. Nothing's wrong. Go to bed.
Go to bed. It'll be all right in the morning.
Now, what that clip foreshadowed and what none of the counselors or anybody could have realized at that time on the night of the 13th, when they were hearing those noises, was that 3 young Girl Scouts were brutally beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. And it's eerie to me, Gibbs, because you heard that woman who in 1977 was a little girl at the camp. She met these 3 young girls that we're going to talk about in detail, and they talked about her staying with them in that tent.
Man, that's kind of scary.
It really is scary, but one of the things you heard her say was that, she didn't want to because that tent was so far removed or so far away. It was the farthest away of all the tents. And that's going to come into play here. It would be talked about a lot that this tent where these 3 girls were staying was out of the 8 tents in this Kiowa section. It was the most remote. And it was also out of the view from the counselors' tents. The bodies of these 3 young girls would be found by a camp counselor by the name of Carla Wilhite. The next morning, she was walking to the bathhouse around 6 a.m. to take a shower. The bodies of the 3 young girls were found by Carla Wilhite about 150 feet from their tent along the trail path. One of the victims was partially clothed, and the other 2 were almost like, what would you call it, Gibbs, buried in their sleeping bags.
Yeah. One of the girls was laying partially clothed on the trail. On top of her were the 2 other girls in their own sleeping bags, but they were buried in their sleeping bags, like shoved down. They were stacked on top of her, and then like kind of on top of that was like a flashlight. And this is what she sees.
And what a horrifying sight for this camp counselor. So the counselor, Carla Wilhite, she immediately goes to her boss, which was a woman by the name of Barbara Day, who was the camp director. And Barbara's husband is at the camp with her, staying there with her. And as they both hear this news, he takes off, he goes to the site and sees this scene that we've laid out, Gibbs, and he immediately calls the police. Now, what we have to talk about is what's going on in this camp. It's early in the morning. They now know that they have 3 campers that have been killed, but they have a whole campground full of these Girl Scouts.
Yeah, just in this zone, who knows what they have in the total campers in all the other zones.
Yeah, we know there was 27 in the Kiowa section. I don't know that I saw the total number.
Right.
But they have to start worrying about the safety of them, and they got to get them the heck out of there. So they load everybody on buses and start sending them back home to Tulsa.
Yeah, they were gone by no later than 10 a.m. in the morning. They were loaded and gone and out of there.
So camp officials reacted really quickly to get these girls out. Now, obviously, they didn't really want them to know what happened, I'm sure. They didn't want them to be subjected to that kind of horrific news or horrific scene.
Yeah, I agree.
You have all these kids going home 2 days into what was supposed to be a 2-week camp. They don't know why. And you have the counselors who are calling all these kids' parents saying there was an accident at the camp. We're sending everybody home. So, of course, these parents are flocking to the bus stop area because they don't know exactly what happened. They want to make sure that their girls are okay. Because by this time, it had already hit the news cycle that 3 girls had been murdered at Camp Scott. Now, there was no victims' names broadcasted at that time, which would cause panic, right? As a parent, you find out that 3 little girls were murdered at the camp that your daughter is at, and you don't know who it is?
It's just like in today's world, when we hear that the school goes down, lockdown because there's a possible shooter in the area, you feel like you got to run up to the school and get your kid. Yeah, no, I couldn't imagine waiting for my kids to get off that bus. I'd be there, just nervous as can be, making sure that I'm going to see my kids in that window of that bus or stepping off, out of that bus.
And then you have the police who have to make the rounds to the parents' homes of the 3 girls that were actually killed. And in the beginning stages, Gibbs, they're only telling the parents that the girls were in an accident that resulted in their deaths. They didn't want to shock them any further at that point, but we talked about the news media, and they're already starting to broadcast some of the details about what really happened to these 3 girls.
So this is how the parents would really find out the outcome of what happened to their daughters, which is scary, man. It was already bad news. You just heard that your daughters died of some type of accident at camp. There's a big difference between an accident at camp and being brutally murdered at camp.
Yeah, and what a horrible way to find out. You've already talked to the police. They didn't tell you, and now you've had to find it out through watching the news?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem right.
This is 1977. You imagine if that was today? You wouldn't even, I don't think more than 15 minutes would probably go by the time it was leaked.
No, yeah, it would be on Facebook and Twitter and some breaking news that would pop up on your phone probably.
Very matter-of-factly, that Lori had been found dead out behind her tent, and that was it. She was extremely bright, and I always wonder what she would have accomplished with a lot of heartbreak.
So, of course, that was Lori's dad talking a little bit about, how he was notified. He and his wife were notified. But then also talking a little bit about Lori. That's the one thing about this case, Gibbs. We don't have a lot of information on the victims. Now, and we haven't even given all their names yet, which we're going to do. But I wanted to play that tape because it definitely goes to what we were talking about in regards to how the parents were notified. Now, police are now at the camp, and they would begin to process the crime scene. And it was said that during this time, it was very quiet, and you could see people tearing up. You could hear them crying as they had to witness the police investigating these 3 little lifeless bodies. And you have to think about the setting, right? This is a wooded area, probably like a beautiful landscape. But then you have this horrific scene in the middle of it.
Yeah, it's just a terrible visual.
One of the victims' body I would estimate to be 70 degrees, was still warm. The other 2 were in sleeping bags, and which had some protection from the elements. And from there, we started our investigation. I found a hank of sash cord that in that general area that was dry other than dew. So this would indicate that the crime was committed sometime after 11 o'clock, or that sash cord was put there after 11 o'clock because it had not been rained on.
So that was Sheriff Weber kind of taking charge of the scene and talking about what they found. And police would also find on site or on the victims a flashlight, tape, rope, and some type of gag. And Gibbs, you talked about the sleeping bags, and they would find bloody mattress covers and towels stuffed inside the sleeping bags. It appeared to police that the suspect or suspects had used them to wipe down the bloody floor inside the tents. But this is very strange to me because, number one, why would they take time to try to wipe up the blood? By all accounts, they did a horrible job of it.
Yeah.
They just smeared it around.
And to me, it's just bizarre. And I think trying to get into their head, why would they do that? Do, like you said, a crappy job of it. And then they basically stack the bodies on the trail. So did they get spooked off? Was their plan to take the bodies with them so they would never be found? I mean, why would you go through the effort to wipe up the blood? It just doesn't. If you're going to leave the bodies, why would you wipe up the blood?
Well, yeah, I think that's where I'm getting at. Not to mention the fact of how much extra time that takes, and you're putting yourself at greater risk to get caught.
Yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't make sense to me. I can't figure it out. Now, at the crime scene, in and around the camp, and especially around the girls' tent, police found some shoe prints. And one in particular was a 9.5 military style shoe print. And police were able to track these shoe prints or boot prints into and then back out of one of the counselors' tents. And it was noted that a pair of glasses and a purse had been stolen from that tent. So obviously this was a huge case and a huge investigation. And it would be 3 days after the murders occurred. There were a couple of squirrel hunters out, and they found a sack of flour in front of a cave that was about 3 miles away from Camp Scott. They didn't know what to make of it, but they called the highway patrol anyway to report it. Investigators come out, they go inside this cave, and they find photographs of 2 women, a roll of masking tape with a piece of plastic garbage bag stuck to it, 2 pieces of newspaper, and a pair of broken sunglasses in a beige vinyl case.
Which really sparks their interest.
No, it would have to, because they're seeing a lot of things that are matching up with what they found at Camp Scott. And the newspaper, Gibbs, is of particular interest because at the crime scene, when they found that flashlight, there was a piece of newspaper that was inside the flashlight, kind of, I don't know if it's holding the batteries in place. And this newspaper was the April 17th edition of the Tulsa World. And it would turn out that this was the exact same edition as the piece discovered in the flashlight that was left next to the girls' bodies.
And, growing up, I remember we would take newspaper and tear it and fold it to do the same thing in flashlights. I actually remember doing that a couple occasions growing up on some flashlights to make sure that the batteries would connect properly. To make that connection, you had to wedge it in there to make sure it worked. So that's interesting. This happened with this one here too. But how interesting is that the flashlight they find ties back to this cave with this material in it.
Yeah, so you have that. You have the eyeglasses, right? And we know that a pair of eyeglasses were stolen out of a counselor's tent. And then we have to talk about the garbage bag that they found in the cave. And it also tied back to the flashlight because what they found on the flashlight was a piece of garbage bag covering the lens. And there was a slit made in the garbage bag, which is essentially would take the beam of light and narrow it.
So just trying to control the beam.
so that it was more concentrated, a smaller beam of light, so that it would be less likely to be seen, I guess.
That's some pre-planning.
No, it definitely is. I mean, it's thinking ahead, and it's actually really smart if you think about it. There was a landowner near the camp that would later say that he heard quite a bit of, some type of vehicle traffic on a remote road near the camp between 2:30 and 3 a.m. that next morning of the 14th. And then the autopsy results would come back. And Gibbs, they would confirm just how horrific these murders really were. And this is where we have to talk about the victims. So there was Lori Lee Farmer. Lori was only 8 years old. She was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And at 8 years old, Gibbs, Lori Farmer was the youngest girl at the camp. We're going to talk about these three victims. They're all young, and there's not a lot out there, Gibbs, about these three girls.
And that's because they didn't get the chance to be kids, man.
No, they didn't. They didn't live a long life. And we're talking about 1977. But these were great girls.
Absolutely, man.
Their family loved them. What was out there about all three of them was nothing but praise. These were good girls. And you even heard Lori's dad talk about it, how Lori didn't get a chance to live her life. And he's always wondered, apparently she was very intelligent. That is the one thing that he talked about. And he's always wondered, what would she have become? And you have to imagine that is a sentiment shared by all three of the victims' families, right? They're so young. What would they have done with their lives?
I researched this, and then last night, so my 9-year-old niece spent the night with us, and all I could think about was, how could somebody do what they did that you're going to hear happen to these girls, to somebody that young, to anybody, but to somebody that young, that tiny? I don't know. It was tough.
No, I think to your point, Gibbs, this would be a horrific crime committed against anyone. But when you're talking about girls this young, it just makes it that much more senseless, that much more horrific, that much more harder to take. There's no other way to say it. Now, in the case of Lori Farmer, the autopsy would show that she had been beaten in the head with some type of instrument that was consistent with either a pipe or a crowbar, something like that. And this is what killed her. They also determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Now, the one thing that they could not confirm was any seminal fluid in or on the body. The next victim was Michelle Gousset. She was 9 years old from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And her autopsy would show she had also been beaten in the head with the same type of instrument, either a crowbar or a pipe. And most of her wounds were to the back and to the side of her head. So it was thought that she was struck from behind. But this is what killed her. Now, she was also sexually assaulted, but Gibbs, she was sodomized as well. And again, I know these details are very tough. They're very tough to go through. And this was confirmed by the autopsy because they found seminal fluid. So they could tell that she had been sodomized.
That's terrible.
The third victim was Denise Milner. She was 10 years old from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And unlike the other two girls, it was determined that she had been dragged into the woods from the tent. So she was not killed in the tent like the other two. She was beaten with some type of object, but that's not what killed Denise. She was killed by strangulation. The autopsy said there were indications that she had been sexually assaulted. There were some lacerations that would indicate that, as well as some evidence of seminal fluid. So again, Gibbs, it doesn't get much worse than this.
No.
And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the specifics because it's just too tough.
Yeah, I can't do it.
But I want to play a clip from Lori's mom in which she reads a letter that Lori had written the first day at camp.
Dear Mommy, Daddy, Misty, Jolie, and Kaylee, I've met two new friends, Michelle Gousset and Denise Miller. I'm sharing a tent with them. We're sleeping on cots. I couldn't wait to write you. With love, Lori.
I mean, that's enough to break your heart, Gibbs.
Oh, it certainly is.
I mean, this is an 8-year-old writing a letter to her family. She's just got to the camp, or, sometime after getting to the camp. And Lori's mom would later come out in interviews and say that Lori really wanted to go to a YMCA camp that year. She really didn't want to go to the Girl Scout camp, but her mom made the decision that she was going to go to the Girl Scout camp. And imagine the guilt, Gibbs, after all of this happens. It would be almost unbearable.
Yeah, it'd be hard to sleep at night.
And Lori's mom has said as much.
Yeah.
That she has had not just the fact that your daughter was murdered, but the guilt around the decision to send her. You can't blame her. She had no idea that this was going to happen, but that doesn't stop the guilt.
No, and it won't. It's just, but I get it. I mean, we make those decisions, when your kid doesn't want to go somewhere, especially camp, and you prepaid, you're like, no, you're going.
Yeah,
you're going.
We make those type of decisions every day with our kids. Then you have Denise Milner, and it would come out later that, she was nervous about going to camp. She really didn't want to leave behind her 5-year-old sister all alone. Now, Denise's mom was a single parent, and she convinced her to go because she thought she would have a good time. But again, that's a decision that each of these parents have to live with, but they didn't make the wrong decision. Right? It's not bad parenting. They thought this was going to be good for their children. And you and I talked about it before we started recording. We went to camp. I had a great time at camp.
You went to band camp.
I did not go to band camp. One time at band camp?
Yeah, one time at band camp.
No, I didn't go to band camp, but I met new friends, did activity. I just thought it was a lot of fun. And Denise would also write a letter home to her mother about the first night of camp. She talked about her roommates, Lori and Michelle. She talked about the storm that had rolled in that night, but she also talked about the fact that she was very homesick and that she wanted to come home.
Be kind of rough seeing that letter.
It would be. It would be.
Because we want to protect our kids. We don't want our kids to feel that way.
No, nobody does. But I want to play another clip from Lori's mom.
If I had known a tent had been slashed the night before Lori was to get on the bus to go, I would have never let her go. And when we got up there and saw the arrangement of the area, it is not the way we thought our child was going to be in a camp area. I would not have stayed in the tent Lori was in as an adult. I would not have stayed there. I would have been frightened. And as a parent of a child who was murdered, the hardest thing for me is to accept that I let her go into that situation. And I will never get over that guilt, ever.
I mean, you can just hear it in her voice. Unbelievably rough. So getting back to the investigation, and we're going to wind our way into suspects, but the police, we talked about these 2 photographs that were found in the cave. 2 separate photographs of 2 separate women. The police end up putting these photographs in the newspaper in the hopes that somebody can identify them. And somebody does. They come forward, identify the 2 women, and through that identification, the police are able to trace the photographs back to a prison photo lab where they were developed. And it's through this that they figure out that the person that developed the pictures, processed them, was a prisoner by the name of Gene Leroy Hart. Police theorized that Hart kept these photos because the women reminded him of his wife. So now the connection is made, Gibbs. The connection between Gene Leroy Hart and the cave where the photos were found, but also the items stolen from Camp Scott. We have to talk a little bit about Gene Leroy Hart. He's known as an outdoorsman. His mom lived very close to Camp Scott. He was a Cherokee, Native American, but he had served time in prison in 1966 for kidnapping and first-degree rape of 2 pregnant women. So this guy's got a bad history.
Yeah, really bad history.
He was paroled in 1969.
Which is really
3
Again,
years, Gibbs.
3 years for assault and first-degree rape.
And kidnapping. Don't forget that.
Yeah. Just seems, I don't know. Again, we talk about it all the time.
Slap
Doesn't
on
seem
the
like a
wrist.
lot, especially to those 2 women that were raped. Now, I know in some of the discovery and investigation of that crime back then, people would say that these 2 women went with him, on their own. They weren't kidnapped. They were just drunk, and that, he took them down a country road, and they all 3 got out and laid in this ditch and had sex, and then he got up and left them there. That's what comes out.
So we don't know all the facts of that case, but he was convicted.
Yeah, exactly.
So to get 3 years, if the jury or whatever thought he didn't do it, then he wouldn't have been convicted.
Right. I don't know too many women that would want to go together, drunk or not, and go down a country road and go lay in the ditch and have sex and then say, okay, thanks and see ya.
And these 2 women were pregnant.
And they were pregnant.
You and I get off on that tangent all the time about how little time some of these people serve. Then you think about it, as a woman, how does that make them feel? That what happened to them was essentially 3 years.
I mean, it just shows how much the system devalued them.
I don't know how else they could think of it other than, really? What happened to me was worth 3 years of this man's freedom? That's it? That's what you're telling me?
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
So shortly after he's paroled for this incident, Hart is arrested and sentenced for 4 burglaries and some assaults, and this is going to put him in prison. But he would somehow escape from prison in 1973. So we know the murders happened in 1977. Gene Leroy Hart is essentially going to be on the run for the 4 years leading up to these murders. But at this point, Hart is firmly on police radar. They're pursuing him, but it's going to take 10 months for them to catch up with him. They arrest Hart on April 6, 1978. At the time, Gibbs, this was the largest manhunt in state history.
When you think about it, remember, he was an outdoorsman. He's a Native American, and he knows the area. He knows how to live off the land.
Well, and he also had a lot of friends, especially within the Cherokee Nation. And it was said that they didn't believe that he had done anything in relation to these Girl Scout murders. I do think that he got a lot of help, during the 4 years and then in the 10 months that it took him to catch up with him.
And so they end up finding him in a shack on one of his Cherokee Nation friends' property, which happens to be the medicine man for the Cherokee Nation of that tribe.
Yeah, so this was in the Cookson Hills area. They apprehend Gene Leroy Hart, and they put him back in prison to serve the sentence that he was already supposed to be serving.
Yeah, before he decided to escape.
And now he's waiting for a new trial in connection with the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. And we kind of touched on it, but there was a lot of local families, a lot of local area residents that believed Hart was innocent, and they went about raising money for his defense fund. Some people also brought forward the fact that Hart had a vasectomy, and so they felt that the sperm evidence that was found at the scene could not be connected to him. Hart spoke to the local news about his daily rituals, his Cherokee roots, and he talked a lot about the fact that he felt that he was being framed for these murders solely based on the fact that he was Native American. Now, you talk to the sheriff felt he was absolutely guilty. And the DA and the prosecutors felt that way too, Gibbs, because they moved forward with the trial. A jury of 6 men and 6 women was picked, and the trial began in March of 1979 in the Mays County Courthouse. There would be over 32 witnesses in the trial. You had Larry Dry take the stand. He was a convict, a former associate of Hart's. You had a number of Camp Scott counselors, Carla Wilhite, who discovered the bodies, Dee Elder, Susan Emery, and Karen Mitchell. Ann Reed was a forensic chemist. and Neil Hoffman, who was Oklahoma State medical examiner. And then you had John McLeod, who was a Cornell University professor of anatomy and an expert on the human reproduction system. And it was McLeod who testified that sperm taken from the bodies and from Hart's underwear were, quote, quite similar. Ann Reed, the forensic chemist, testified that hair samples taken from the bodies and from Hart's head were, quote, exactly the same. She said that the hairs either had to have come from Hart or from someone else that had hair with the exact same microscopic characteristics. And I think that's important, Gibbs, because what she's saying is, I mean, this is not like when you hear in a trial, DNA says it has to be 1 in 32 million. She's not saying it like that. And it's really hard to figure out what that means in terms of how many people could have hair with the same microscopic characteristics as another person. But what's interesting is that, as of 2015, the FBI has admitted how many problems there are associated with microscopic hair analysis to the point where it's been discredited as a forensic technique. They're basically saying it doesn't work, to the degree that they would need to prove things.
I mean, there's a difference between the late 70s and today. So much technology advances.
Well, and again, a lot of things that they thought were really good indicators of guilt or innocence 40 years ago, they've now changed their mind on. As technology advances, they realize the way they interpreted things or what they thought about evidence and scientific testing back then doesn't hold the same weight today that they thought it did back then. And then we have to talk about the items that were discovered in that cave about 3 miles from Camp Scott. And the cave in particular, I mean, there were witnesses that said Hart had used this cave during his time on the run. And Hart knew this cave very well because the cave was just 100 feet from his childhood home. I mean, the home was no longer there, but they knew that it was very close to where he grew up. He would have explored it all the time, most likely, or at the very least been extremely familiar with it. And we talked about some of the items, pair of sunglasses that were alleged to have been stolen from one of the counselor tents at Camp Scott, a roll of tape that matched some tape that was found at the scene of the crime. And then you had those 2 photographs that were allegedly developed by Hart while he was working in a prison photo lab. And there were a couple of items recovered from the shack where they captured Hart. One was a mirror and one was a toy pipe, which on the stand, one of the Camp Scott counselors testified that these 2 items had been taken from her tent. And we talked about the flashlight a little bit. It was left behind at the crime scene. It had been modified using this plastic garbage bag with a slit through it over the lens so that it would only emit a very small slice of light. But what would come out at trial from one of Hart's associates is that Hart was known to modify flashlights in this way. Remember, we talked about he was a burglar. You can imagine robbing houses in the dark using a flashlight, Gibbs. You would want to throw as little light as possible and probably direct it in a very small beam.
Yeah, just like an isolated beam,
So a lot of testimony towards the guilt of Gene Leroy Hart.
Part of it would have involved items that were taken from the Girl Scout camp the same night as the homicides occurred. Some of these were found in a location called the Cellar Cave. And the Cellar Cave was attached to Gene Leroy Hart during that period of time as a hiding place while he had escaped through there was a witness who had put him there. But there was also physical evidence in the cave that not only tied him to the cave, the Cellar Cave as it was referred to, but also in that sense tied him to the items that had been taken during the same evening or night of these crimes. Additionally, there was a testimony concerning the hair. As I recall, the little Milner girl Her hands were taped with tape or duct tape, as I recall, and that a hair found embedded in the tape between the hands of the little girl matched in all characteristics Gene Leroy Hart's hair. Now, hair is not an absolute means of identification or accepted as an absolute means of identification, but when you take that along with other evidence, certainly it has probative value, and it did in this case, in my opinion.
You know, I almost get the sense that he kind of got a little choked up there when he was talking about the Milner girl.
Yeah, when he was talking about Denise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that, from the prosecution standpoint, laying out a little bit, most of what we talked about, I thought what I took from that, Gibbs, was the hair. What we didn't say was that the hair was found in some type of duct tape that was used to bind her hands. It was very specific in the place that it was found. So then you get to the defense, and they bring forward their witnesses. They had a man named Alan Little, who was a former Mays County Sheriff's jailer. He testified about the photos linked to Hart, that he saw them in the sheriff's office after Hart escaped in 1973. And the defense pounced on that and tried to use that to put doubt in the mind of the jury that this evidence must have been planted in that cave. Then they brought to the stand Sam Pigeon. And Pigeon was an older man. He was a Cherokee. And it was at his shack where they captured Gene Leroy Hart. And they had to have an interpreter for Sam Pigeon to even testify, a Cherokee interpreter, but he testified that he had never seen the items in his home that the agent said they recovered. So again, all of this is leading towards evidence was planted.
Exactly. And we've heard that before in other cases, especially around this time frame.
And then you had a woman named Joyce Payne, a woman who testified and implicated a Kansas convict named Bill Stevens in the murders. And we're going to talk about Bill Stevens a little bit later on as a possible suspect, but the outcome of the testimony of Joyce Payne was that she was charged with perjury for some of the statements that she made. And she ended up pleading no contest to get a reduced charge.
They came with a lot of scientific evidence and a lot of claims, and all that was just, the evidence that they presented at the trial was based upon science, a lot of it, and we were able to show that it was not reliable. Blood, hair, saliva. Just two quick examples. One, there's a thumbprint on the flashlight, and it's not Hart's thumbprint. And then another piece of evidence was that there was a footprint in the blood in the tent, and the footprint was, I think, a 9.5, and Hart's feet were 11.5. So you can't change your fingerprints or shrink your feet. So, those are scientific pieces of evidence that fly in the face of the allegation.
Can't shrink your feet, Gibbs.
Can't do it.
And if the boot doesn't fit,
Must have quit.
you must have quit.
Yeah, no shrinking.
But no shrinkage?
No shrinkage.
But I do think it's interesting to hear the defense team talk about how they're able to combat what is essentially a lot of scientific evidence. And we talked about the boot print early on, right? The police finding a 9.5 boot print, walking through the blood, walking into one of the counselors' tents and back out. Well, if that's a 9.5, and Gene Leroy Hart has a size 11.5 foot, chances are he didn't make that boot print. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't involved.
No, or he could have shoved his feet into a smaller boot.
I don't know. Two full sizes is tough.
That would be tough. Maybe he cut the top off and his toes are hanging out.
That'd actually be really smart if you think about it.
Yeah, actually, it would be, wouldn't it?
It scares me that you would literally, off the bat, think of that.
Yeah.
Almost like you've used it in some previous escapade of yours. So after the 9-day trial, the jury could not find convincing, undeniable evidence against Hart. They deliberated for 5 hours before acquitting Hart of the murders. But remember, Hart's still in prison. He still has to finish out his 305-year sentence for his earlier arrest on assault and burglary charges, which ultimately got pushed up to 305 years after his prison escape. So one of the jurors said the decision was not made to clear Hart. Many on the jury felt that this monstrous crime must have been committed by more than one person. And I think they talked about, Gibbs, the footprints. It really weighed heavily in the minds of jurors that they didn't match Hart's shoe size. And they couldn't match the thumbprint on the flashlight, which the defense talked about.
We felt like there was a lot of manufactured evidence, a lot of sloppiness in the old procedure.
Leela Ramsey was one of 6 women who sat on the jury that heard Hart's case. She remembers testimony from an Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agent that created grave doubts.
Larry Bowles was on the stand being interviewed. I mean, we was on he was talking to the jury, and Garvin Isaacs asked him, said, were any pictures taken the day over there when they arrested Gene Hart? And he said, no, not any. He said, you didn't take any pictures? And they said, no. We're sitting here looking at 8 by 10 glossies of that very man posed like he'd bagged a big game. He lied to us. I'm not saying he's not guilty, but I am saying that the evidence showed he was not one person done by themselves. We all 12 agreed on that there was enough evidence to show that it had been more than one person.
So that's one of the jurors speaking out. And what I really take away from that is the fact that she's saying, I'm not saying he's not guilty. And I think you find that in some of these cases, right? It's not that always that jurors don't believe that a person is guilty, but they're doing the job that they're supposed to do, which is weigh all the evidence and decide whether or not that evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, proves that someone's guilty.
Against whatever charges they were arrested for.
Yes.
So sometimes the prosecution overstretches the charges and it backfires, right? And we've seen that later in some cases that we've done where people are upset. Why did the prosecutor go after a lesser charge? Well, because the lesser charge was going to get them the results that they needed. Maybe not get you the death sentence, but it got you the life sentence.
Now, what's strange about Hart is that he would be found dead in prison just a few weeks after he was acquitted of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. He was only 35 years old and died of a massive heart attack after lifting weights on the prison grounds. But as part of this, they did an autopsy which confirmed that his vasectomy did not take.
Did not.
So that was part of the argument. How could the sperm evidence be tied back to him because he had a vasectomy? Well, if it didn't take, that means he's still producing swimmers.
He's got some swimmers.
And we talked about Bill Stevens and how, the woman on the stand in the trial was pointing the finger at him. There were a lot of questions about, did he have something to do with these murders? Because besides the woman that testified at the trial of Gene Leroy Hart, there was another man who had been a co-defendant in a brutal kidnapping case along with Bill Stevens that also came out and said that he was responsible for these murders. So this co-defendant of Bill Stevens was a man by the name of Dwayne Peters. And how this all ties together is that Dwayne Peters was the boyfriend of Joyce Payne, the woman that perjured herself in the trial of Gene Leroy Hart. So we're kind of coming full circle here. And basically how this all shakes out is they were trying to put the Oklahoma murders onto Bill Stevens in the hopes that Dwayne Peters could get a deal and get off lightly for this kidnapping charge that he and Bill, I guess, did together. Now, what we didn't talk about is not only did Payne testify, but she had her son testify too. He got charged with perjury as well. But ultimately, the charge against him was dismissed. But you go back to Bill Stevens, and he always maintained that he was working in Seminole, far away, the day that the 3 girls were murdered. His employers confirmed this. He also had a canceled paycheck and a time card to back it up. So I see this, Gibbs, as nothing more than an attempt to cut a deal by testifying against somebody that essentially had nothing to do with the murders. Eventually, both Stevens and Peters were sentenced to 15 years to life for the kidnapping charge in Kansas. And then later on, Bill Stevens would be stabbed to death in his cell at the Kansas State Penitentiary. And it's been alleged that the person that stabbed him was Dwayne Peters.
Paul Smith was sheriff of Mays County from 1980 to 1985. When he took office, he began his own investigation of the Girl Scout murders, but ran into opposition from politicians and law enforcement agencies that wanted nothing more to do with the case after the acquittal and subsequent death of Gene Leroy Hart. That Paul Smith's research led him to a far different conclusion than the original investigation.
Such as there being one man involved. That just simply isn't true. You can look at the autopsy reports. In each one of them, a man had to have a different tool in each hand. One with a square serrated face like a hammer, and the other one with something like a pipe or a crowbar, something long.
Right.
He'd had to have one in each hand plus some rope, because one of them was tied to the point that it severed the flesh.
And they were tied differently.
Yes, one of them was tied with a half hitch, and one tied with a single overhand knot, and which would suggest to me that two different people who are in the habit of tying knots tie different knots, not the same man doing both. Small things, but very important.
So I find that very interesting. You know, this is Sheriff Smith. He comes in a number of years after the murders have taken place, takes over for Sheriff Weber. He's looking at the case and he's seeing it differently. You know, he's questioning the fact that it could have possibly been one lone person that murdered all three of these girls. Now, what I find most interesting is the knots, because I think I do agree with that. You know, if you're going to tie three knots, wouldn't you just tie the same three knots?
I would think so.
Why would you tie one type of knot on one person and then tie a completely different type of knot on the next?
I mean, most of us have a go-to knot.
Yeah. I'm not a knot guy, so I have like one knot. I don't know all the half hitches and all these type of sailor knots.
The square knot.
So I do think it's interesting, you know, his take on this case. Tie that in with what the jury kind of thought. You have a lot of people thinking this evidence kind of points to the fact that it was more than one man.
And to the point that even Lori Farmer's mom has said publicly that she thought there might have been a female involved with this.
Now, it doesn't mean that Gene Leroy Hart was not one of those men or one of the people that was involved, I should say. So let's talk a little bit about DNA. There was some DNA testing done in 1989. The testing used Hart's body fluids, but the results came back as inconclusive. Then in 2002, as DNA had become more advanced, they did some other types of testing using samples from a pillowcase that came from the crime scene. But what they found out was that the samples were too deteriorated to provide any results. In 2007, they tested a semen sample. And what came out of this, Gibbs, kind of goes back to what you were saying about Lori Farmer's thoughts. There was a partial DNA female profile that came out of this sample or this testing. So they developed this DNA profile, but they couldn't rule it out that it may have come from one of the victims. So that's the case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. You know, Gibbs, kind of looking at some of the things that happened afterwards. No Girl Scouts ever again took the trip to Camp Scott. It's now private property owned by a local citizen. The tents are gone. The platforms are gone. Richard Gousset, the father of Michelle Gousset, went on to help the state legislature pass the Oklahoma Victims Bill of Rights. He also helped found the Oklahoma Crime Victims Compensation Board. And then Sherry Farmer, Lori Farmer's mom, she founded the Oklahoma chapter of Parents of Murdered Children, which is a support group. All right, Gibbs, we've got a couple of voicemails. Let's play those.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Gibby. This is Nicole. I just wanted to say I love your show, and Team Ferguson, not Team Gibby. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And by the way, hey y'all.
Hey y'all.
So I can feel the guilt in her voice.
That she's saying Team Ferguson?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Hey.
You be Team Fergie.
I got to have some Team Fergies out there.
I still love you. That's all right. You come back around.
That's a great voicemail.
That is a great voicemail. You should cherish that.
I'll stick that in my pocket.
Yeah, put that in your pocket.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Gibby. Katie here calling in from D.C. I knew you get a lot of voicemail, so I'll keep this short and sweet. I'm a new listener, and I love the show. It's informative, it's entertaining, and it's funny, but tastefully so considering the subject matter. Thanks so much for all the hard work you guys put into the podcast. Love you guys. Stay safe and keep your own time ticking.
Thanks, Katie. Great voicemail. Keep your own time ticking. Love that.
I do. I like that too. She sounds like a Team Gibby.
I'll give you that. I'll give you that one. But what's great about that is she's a new listener.
Yes.
And that's a great feeling when we hear people say, hey, just found your podcast. I'm binging. I love it. Man, that makes me feel great.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Love that stuff. All right, Gibbs. So that's another episode of True Crime All the Time Unsolved, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. So for Mike
and Gibby,
stay safe and keep your own time ticking.